Welcome to Language Access Matters, the podcast that dives deep into the crucial role of language access in public services and businesses. I am your host, Carol Velandia, and I invite you to join me on a journey of discovery and empowerment. Language access is not just a matter of convenience. It is a fundamental human right and the key that unlocks doors to essential services and opportunities. In this podcast, we'll explore the far-reaching impact of language access, examining how it shapes not only healthcare, justice, and education, but also the world of business. Through thought-provoking interviews, insightful discussions, and compelling stories, we will unveil the power of language access. We will hear from professionals who bridge communication gaps to provide quality care for diverse communities. We will explore the intersection of language, law, and justice, and the crucial role that interpreters and translators play in ensuring fair and equitable treatment. We will delve into the challenges and innovations as well as how language access opens doors to effective communication and inclusion and how it makes our society more equitable. But our exploration doesn't stop there. We will also uncover the profound impact of language access in the world of business. We will hear from entrepreneurs, industry leaders, and experts who understand the value of inclusive and effective communication and how it drives success in today's global marketplace. Language Access Matters is your platform to understand the significance of language access in these vital sectors of society. We will shed light on the barriers faced by individuals and communities and the innovative solutions that promote inclusion and equality. Whether you are a healthcare professional, a legal expert, an educator, a business owner, a linguist, an advocate, or simply passionate about the power of language, this podcast is for you. Together, we will navigate the challenges, celebrate the victories, and advocate for a world where language access truly matters. So, join me on this enlightening journey as we uncover the impact of language access in healthcare, justice, education, and businesses. Let's amplify the voices of the 25 million people that don't speak English in the United States and those that don't speak the dominant language around the world. Those voices deserve to be heard and empowered, and we need to empower ourselves to build a more inclusive future. Welcome to Language Access Matters. Let's embark on this transformative exploration together. Hello, everybody. I'm Carol Velandia, your host at Language Access Matters. Today, I have a very special guest, Jace Norton. He discovered a love for languages while volunteering as a missionary for 2 years in Guatemala from 2010 to 2012. During that time, he learned Spanish and Quechua, a Mayan language from Guatemala, fluently. He later went on to major in Arabic at Brigham Young University and spent considerable time studying and working in Amman, Jordan. Although he never expected to work in the field of language access, his life experiences and circumstances seemed to propel him towards it. He was eventually recruited to work as a Quechua interpreter, where he began to understand the considerable demand for Quechua and other indigenous languages in the US. Not long after becoming an interpreter, Jace felt compelled to do more for indigenous language access than he could do on his own and founded Maya Bridge in 2021. Since then, he and his team have worked towards filling the niche needed for language services in indigenous and other lower diffusion languages and have worked virtually every state and across all fields. Maya Bridge now provides services in over 100 indigenous languages and other lower diffusion languages from around the world, along with other widely spoken languages like Spanish, French, and Russian. Jace lives in Salt Lake City, Utah, with his 8-year-old son, who both keeps him young and makes him feel very old. And he enjoys rock climbing and
and doing this in his free time. Welcome, Jace. I
Thank
am
you.
delighted to have you here.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yes, and so, Jace, indigenous language is something that we don't know much about. So I would love to hear from you what drew you to learn Quiche. And first, please correct my pronunciation. What drew you to learn this specific language, and how did that experience help you understand the realities faced by speakers of Mayan languages?
Yeah, so like you mentioned in my bio, I volunteered to serve as a missionary for my church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. There's many of us in my faith that go off and volunteer to serve missions, and we go all around the world. So I was assigned to go to Guatemala, and when I got there, I was originally assigned to speak Spanish, but when I got there, I was assigned to go and live and work and be with people who do not really speak Spanish very much, if at all. And so I spent, most of my 2 years in Guatemala. Most of that time I was living with the Kekchi people.
Mhm.
And as a missionary, our job is really talking to people. That's kind of the main thing that we do. We go to people's homes, we talk to people, we help out with our local churches and things like that in the area. We teach lessons in church and things like that. So I needed to be able to speak. And beyond that, I was really just so fascinated by the beauty, the complexity, the richness of the language and the culture. And that really fueled my passion to want to not just be able to get by, but to really be as fluent as I possibly could. And so I put in a lot of work to learn it. And just like you mentioned, in my bio, I never expected that after learning this beautiful language that I would really do much with it, which is why I went on to study Arabic. I was planning on doing completely different things. But I was eventually recruited to be a Kekchi interpreter, and that's when I realized that there is this massive demand for indigenous language services here in the U.S. And the Mayan languages in Guatemala. There's 22 different Mayan languages just from Guatemala, and then you have a lot of different indigenous languages from Mexico, other indigenous languages from other parts of Central and South America that have a lot more prominence here because there's more migration coming from countries that are closer geographically to the United States.
You're totally right. People don't know much about language, indigenous languages, and much less about Mayan languages. I didn't know when I first started working as an interpreter how many languages there were in different countries that were indigenous, and to me it has been a pleasant surprise to find the richness of our culture in Latin America. And I don't even know if all of this would even be considered part of Latin America. But what I mean to say is that we know very little about the language diversity in each of our countries.
Right.
So I find it even more important to underscore how language access impacts these communities. So, in your opinion, why is language access critical when it comes to Mayan languages like Quiche? And if you could share some of the unique challenges indigenous languages speakers face when trying to access services.
Sure. So when we talk about indigenous languages, there's kind of a couple of different definitions that we need to really flush out a little bit. So indigenous just means that it's from a certain region. It's endemic to that region. It comes from that region, right? So for example, you could say that now English is indigenous. Technically, you could make that argument that it's indigenous to the United States, meaning that um, now it is the most dominant language spoken in the United States. So if you're from the United States, it's likely you're going to speak that language. But really, and that's true of every kind of global, country that exists now, right? Like Germany, German is indigenous to Germany. Well, in reality, German came from migrants that came from other parts of the world. But when we talk about indigenous languages, what we're really referring to is languages that are not only from this geographic region, but also they have several disadvantages, meaning that they don't typically, because they've been intentionally oppressed by some other, conquering force. They've been intentionally oppressed. They've experienced essentially ethnic cleansing, genocide, all kinds of horrible things that these larger, more dominant colonizing forces have then come and, you know, and it basically coerce them to speak their language. To they're trying to kind of stamp out those languages and those cultures, which is really, really sad. Because of that, a lot of the indigenous languages from around the world now have this huge disadvantage of they have had the kind of the tails skip, the scales tipped against them intentionally, meaning that they've intentionally removed resources for them, right? So with the Mayans, for example, in the 1500s, they took all these texts that were Mayan texts that were very important and contained a lot of history and a lot of that culture and just the writing system itself, and they burned them, right? So things like this happen pretty much universally all around the world, where you are essentially these global more dominant forces are colonizing, settling, taking over, and use very brutal tactics to prevent those people from continuing their cultures and their languages. So here in the United States, as well as in other parts of Latin America, people are have often historically been forbidden from speaking their language. They have not been allowed to teach them or learn them in schools and things like that. So now you fast forward to today, and we have this the setup where people that speak indigenous languages don't have any resources to really learn literacy in their indigenous languages. And beyond just the literacy part, they've also been put in situations where they're impoverished, right? Indigenous populations have typically been exploited, have been extorted, have had their lands taken away from them. So they've essentially been intentionally set up to fail. And these globalizing colonial settler forces want them to basically assimilate and for that culture to go away. And now you're part of the whatever country that they've established. You're part of that identity now. And so what that means with language access is now that these people they don't have the ability to have their languages. They don't have the education system that would be needed to be able to support their language learning in their own native languages. And so when we talk about language access in the interpretation industry, we're often talking about um, limited English proficiency, right? That's kind of the term that we use. But we need to remember that individuals that speak indigenous languages, in addition to being, in this field of being limited English proficient or having limited English proficiency, they also have limited Spanish proficiency.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very important to know that, because when somebody comes to the hospital and speaks in Spanish and is able to start a conversation and say, I need this service or I need help, the majority of the nurses and providers are going to hear the Spanish and say, okay, we need a Spanish interpreter. And so they provide a Spanish interpreter, but then it turns out that that person's using Spanish to try and get their needs, but they're not fully comfortable, fully fluent, and they have limited proficiency in Spanish. So with indigenous people, you have to remember kind of those two things. First of all, that they have limited proficiency often in another more dominant language, and that they've been sort of set up intentionally, often by these more dominant groups and societies, to not have those resources. And so then when you talk about translation, for example, you can't just provide a written translation in a language like Quechua, because the vast majority of individuals that speak Quechua won't be able to read it. So you have to.
You mentioned how many people, for example, have misconceptions about Mayan languages or indigenous languages. You defined the term indigenous languages, right?
Sure.
And you also mentioned about how dominant languages are treated or rather Mayan languages are treated as you would treat a dominant language when it comes to access. So would you say that one of the biggest misconceptions, for example, that affects Mayan language speakers is the fact that there is no recognition of those languages in that geographical area? So, for example, as you pointed out, if somebody from Guatemala comes and asks for services and they use the Spanish to ask for this service, nobody asks beyond that. They just pair or ask for a Spanish interpreter without asking if there is a secondary language or actually their language of origin. So would you say that that's one of the biggest misconceptions people have when they are trying to provide the service, but they don't even know that Spanish is not might not even be the language of the person.
Yeah, I mean, there's really a lot of different misconceptions, like you said, about indigenous languages, and so I mean,
What would be the top 5 misconceptions other than not knowing that a certain region
right.
has multiple
Well,
languages?
so I mean, the first problem is that people just aren't aware, especially here in the United States. I mean, I think, barely, a lot of us here in the United States, unfortunately, are barely aware that some of these countries even exist, right? Like, oh, Guatemala, I've never, some people in the United
Never
States
heard of it.
never heard of this country before. So that's kind of the problem number one, is like this really broad.
Besides having little knowledge about geography and whether or not a country has more languages than we might think, what would you say are other misconceptions around indigenous languages?
So probably the biggest misconception when it comes to indigenous languages is that most people, and this is true both here in the United States and in parts of Latin America specifically, that most people refer to indigenous languages as being a dialect. And somehow, at some point, people started using this. It is a technical linguistic term incorrectly, right? The word dialect, the definition is a variation of the language typically based on the geographic location where it's spoken. That's what it means. And but somehow people started referring to indigenous languages as dialect to sort of put them in this secondary category of being sort of a lesser language, like not as good, right? It's very
Demeaning, almost.
charged, yes, a charged connotation to mean, not that many speakers or not developed, whatever it is that they're thinking, they're kind of associating that with the word dialect. And so you'll often hear people in Spanish they say, oh, they're speaking in their little dialect, and they'll use words like little, right? And it's diminutive, right? You're diminishing the value of that language, right? It's not as good as our language, or it's not the same as our language in a negative way.
But also, would you say that with that comes the thought that being a dialect means that they will understand the main language but not the
Yes.
but and that therefore they don't need to use the dialect? Because I perceive that is problematic when people refer to the dialects and think that, but they would still understand Spanish, just they're using their little dialect, as you said.
Yep. So, yeah, and because some of us do understand that the word dialect just means slightly different of that language, then you might get a judge, for example. I've heard this happening where an interpreter said, "Your Honor, I believe that the individual speaks a dialect," and I think they actually said a dialect of Spanish, which again, you're setting yourself up to then have all these misconceptions. So then the judge, and this happens many times, where the judge or the provider will say, "Well, then they should understand a decent amount of Spanish. So let's just continue in Spanish." And also because indigenous languages from Latin America and really all over the world, they have a lot of borrow words, right? From the indigenous or from the more dominant language, they'll have borrowed words that they then use. And so then, someone who doesn't really understand that would say, well, I'm hearing them say, iglesia for church. And so I am going to assume that they speak Spanish. So I'm just going to say, let's go ahead in Spanish. And that's
Is
really not, it's not ethical. And it's also not, just simply not correct.
not accurate, right? It's as if we were going to say, oh, you know what? Spanish is just a dialect of Latin. Let's just speak in Latin because they
Exactly. Right. Or,
understand.
yeah, or someone that would say, oh, well, Portuguese is pretty similar to Spanish. And so, we're just going to continue in Portuguese because we can't find a Spanish interpreter.
That's a really good
We would never
example.
do that. Or if we heard somebody that came into to the clinic and they spoke a little bit of English, we wouldn't just say, well, let's just continue in English because they seem to speak a little bit of English. We would never do that. In fact, we're not allowed to do that under the law. If you're receiving funding from the federal government, it's illegal to do that, right? We need to be able to provide that service to them in their own language.
Right.
And unfortunately, most of the people that are coming here, they're used to never getting language access in their native languages. So many times we've encountered this as a company, and I've encountered it as an interpreter myself. Many times a provider will say, I asked them if they spoke Spanish, and they said yes. But as we've continued on in this interview or this appointment, it's become clear to me that they're not really understanding me. And so then I'll ask, the provider will tell us that I ask them, do you speak any other language? And they'll say, no, I don't. And so again, that's another point where possibly, this isn't to make a blanket statement that's always true, but it is definitely something to consider that people that speak indigenous languages, they think of their own language not as a language, but as a dialect many times. So if you were to ask them, do you speak any other language other than Spanish, they might say no, because they're thinking, well, I don't speak any other language, but I do speak my dialect. So, it's
So they
probably
have internalized almost that
yes, absolutely.
stereotype that is believed about their language. So
Absolutely. And so really it's the most important frontline defense when it comes to language access for indigenous languages are interpreters who are interpreting for these more dominant languages like Spanish or French or Russian. It's really up to them. The provider won't be able to tell, right? They won't necessarily know if someone has limited Spanish proficiency or limited French proficiency. So it's really up to the interpreters to identify when that's happening and to really identify, I don't think this person is understanding fully. I think that they could understand better. And so that's where we need to start investigating. Okay, well, I know you're from Guatemala, and I know because as a Spanish interpreter, I've done my homework, I've done some due diligence. Now I know that there's a lot of indigenous languages. So, I'm going to try to figure out if I can see if this person speaks another language besides Spanish. And, even if you just know the name of one language, as we talked about, there's 22 different Mayan languages in Guatemala, and there's two extra indigenous languages from Guatemala that are non-Mayan languages. But if I know, for example, now I've heard this language Kekchi, so then I can rephrase my question and I can say something like, instead of just saying, do you speak Spanish, right? Because typically most people will just say yes. Um, Instead of just asking that, or instead of asking, do you speak any other language, you can say, is there another language, right? Or, in Spanish, you can use the word lengua, which kind of is like a middle between dialect or, idioma, like language. You can say, what other languages maybe do you speak at home? For example, like Kekchi, right? And then that might open the door for them to say, oh, well, okay, now I understand what you're talking about. And I actually speak Mam, or I speak Quiche, or I speak Kanhoban, whatever it is. And then that interpreter can then go to the appropriate people, and they kind of have to take a stand, right? If they truly believe that that person is not fully understanding, it's kind of on them to take a stand and let their employer or their provider or whoever let them know you need a different interpreter. You don't need a Spanish interpreter, because a
so
lot of
I
people, yeah, will
I
try to just get through because that's what they're there to do. They're there to interpret. But the reality is, if somebody calls you to be a Spanish interpreter and someone shows up speaking Tagalog, what would you do? You'd be obligated to tell the person, I don't speak Tagalog. This person speaks another language. And so you need to get them that interpreter. I'm not just going to try and do my best when I know that I don't speak the same language as them. And unfortunately, and the same thing with English, right? We would never just say, well, let's just try and get through with English. We wouldn't do that. And with languages like Spanish, we would never use, I mean, we probably, some people still do this, but we would not, we know that it's unacceptable to use a family member, right, to interpret for the person, especially a child. And so we have to treat indigenous languages the exact same way, even though they may have some limited proficiency in Spanish. We can't just try and muddle through in Spanish.
correct. So I would say though that there is a two components of this, because on one side we have to revise a lot of our own as interpreters. We have to revise some of what we do when it comes to indigenous languages and our protocols, and even the way we introduce ourselves at the beginning, right? I'm looking for new ideas about how we as interpreters operate to make sure that we offer adequate language access. But I think there is another component that is raising awareness among the speakers of Indigenous languages, because I understand, and I'm a big proponent that the burden is on the professional to provide language access. But I think it will make a lot of sense for speakers of languages other than English also take on that part of the responsibility. And I know that that is a very difficult task to ask, because information on language access is not available in their own languages. So they don't know their own rights.
True.
And I say this for everybody that speaks other language. Many people don't know their rights to language access. So I imagine that's the same with the indigenous population. So I
Yes.
think that it's a two sides of a coin. But it's clear that where we can make the most difference is from the side of the professional. And I agree that perhaps the interpreter is better positioned to do that, but obviously it adds layers of complication when the person doesn't feel comfortable saying I speak mom, right? And you have to sort of dig a little deeper, because
Yeah.
you and it's a little bit counterintuitive also, because interpreters are we're trained not to be we're trained to be impartial, and we're trained not to go beyond what we're supposed to go. So it's hard as an interpreter, and I can already see that there could be a push back on this. That there would be difficulties asking further if the person says, no, I understand Spanish. I have faced it myself. I have encountered this situation,
Yeah.
but it feels uncomfortable, right? Because you don't want to put people on the spot to say, you don't want to insist if they already told you.
Yeah.
So
And we definitely do need to remember that people from indigenous communities have almost universally always experienced extreme oppression, discrimination, violence, extortion, all kinds of horrible, atrocious things based on their indigeneity. And so, yeah, it's definitely 100% possible that somebody from an indigenous community might not be very eager to tell you that they're from an indigenous community. They might not really want to identify as being indigenous or even as speaking that language, because we're seeing many people are saying that as parents they don't want to teach their kids their indigenous language because they have experienced such severe discrimination, and oppression because of the indigenous language they speak, that they won't teach it to their children. And so you can absolutely have somebody who does not, uh, you know, maybe is not, you feel like they're not understanding, and but they're not telling you that they speak an indigenous language. And I guess what I would say in those cases that you need to bring in, at that point you need to bring in somebody who can maybe do something different, right? So at that point we would say, well, where's this person from, right? If you can ask, and almost everybody can tell you where they're from. If we know that they're from Petén, Guatemala, and it seems like they're not understanding, then I know, because of my experiences, right, I know that it's likely that they may speak Quechua, because Quechua is, other than Spanish, is the most dominant of the Mayan languages in that region of Guatemala. So then we can try and bring in someone who speaks Quechua, and then hearing it, they may open up and say, "Oh, okay, yeah, I'm comfortable now speaking Quechua," right?
yeah.
And that basically is the same. That same concept can be applied to pretty much anything, right? If we say, well, this person, for example, is, we're speaking in Russian, but I feel like they're not quite understanding me. Okay, well, where's this person from? Okay, well, they're from Ingusteria, right? And then we say, oh, well, there's actually a language there that we know about called Ingush. And so then we can get that person on the phone, and then they may, once they hear it, someone else speaking their language, they may open up. Uh,
Yes, well, I think it's a great idea. And perhaps, I don't know if you have already done this from your business, but bringing like a map and a list of indigenous languages just for people to keep in mind that there are more than just Spanish in a particular region would be a great
yeah,
idea.
yeah, yep, absolutely. And I think at the end of the day, the important part is, if you feel that someone's not understanding, there's a problem, then it's time to take steps to see what we can do to fix that, right?
Absolutely. I think that is very clear. It's part of our duty as interpreters, and also
Yeah.
it should be part of the duty of care from professionals in all the different public services. So tell me a little bit more about how you ended up creating Mayan languages, and also how have you gone about finding interpreters? Because as you described, it's even well, people are not teaching their own language to children, right? So I imagine that that language will get lost with time, right? Quiche, for example, if the families are not teaching the newcomers their original language. So, how do you go about finding interpreters for your company? So, tell me a little bit more about Maya Bridge and how
Yeah.
do you go about finding interpreters?
So I was working at a emergency intake site in Fort Bliss in Texas, and I was working as a Kekchi interpreter for another language service company. And this company was it had hired me, and I was one of, I think, two Kekchi interpreters that they had working on site for this emergency intake site for unaccompanied children. And it even with just Kekchi, it became clear that they did not have the bandwidth to handle all of the demand just for the Kekchi language, which is the language I speak.
Mm-hmm.
And then you add on top of that all of the Quiche speakers, which they had some limited resources for. And then you add Mam and Canjobal and Acateco and Ixil and Chuf, and they did not have resources for these languages. And kind of the key is that this was for government associated work, and typically with like federal contracts, the interpreters, the linguists that are working on these contracts have to be US based, US authorized, typically either be a permanent resident or a citizen, maybe asylee, or maybe have some kind of a work visa. So in other words, it's very difficult to find in an already lower resource pool to find the people that meet those qualifications. And so this company that I was working for clearly was not up to the task. They didn't have the capability. So we started to kind of shift our approach to really become a fully fledged language service provider instead of just sort of a subcontracting agency that was really only doing one contract. We branched out to become a full language service provider. And our approach was, there's plenty of people that are doing Spanish, plenty of people that are doing Arabic, Mandarin, all the more dominant, more commonly requested languages. Let's go in and let's take the approach of, let's handle languages that are not super commonly requested, and let's make that what we go after. And so that's what we've done. We started off obviously with the Mayan languages because I speak one of the Mayan languages, and because there is a very high demand for languages from Guatemala specifically here in the United States right now. That's kind of what we started as our focus, and then we started growing, and it was just sort of this organic growth of our clients would start asking us, well, what about this language? Can you do this language? And we would go and we'd find people. And the way that we found people really is it's a very active approach. You won't get much success if you put out an ad on the internet on LinkedIn saying, I need Quiche interpreters or Kekchi interpreters. You'll have very limited success. And part of the reason for that is that there aren't that many people who know that that's an option to work as an interpreter, right? They're not aware that there's work to be done because they're not currently working as interpreters. So most of what we've done to find interpreters has been to find people that are qualified, that have the skill set, that speak an indigenous language and speak either English or Spanish, or sometimes another language like French. And we then help them to get the training and the skills that they need to be a professional interpreter, which usually they've already been doing unprofessionally pretty much their whole lives, right? The people that have maintained their indigenous language, it's usually because they live with family members that don't speak English or don't speak Spanish. So they've maintained their indigenous language, and they've been usually interpreting in a non-professional, right? They weren't getting paid to do it throughout their life. And so all we're doing is just helping solidify the skill set that they need, and then providing them with the opportunities to do the work. So it was absolutely a very hands-on approach. I flew to probably close to 20 states over the last 4 years. And I've gone and I've heard, anytime I've heard that there's communities, substantial communities in that area, I'll go there and I'll kind of scout it out. I'll meet with people, talk to people. It's a very, very hands-on approach. I remember when I first hired one of our mom speakers, I had flown to Oakland, California, which is just very well known for being home to tens of thousands of speakers of the Mam language from Guatemala. And I went out on the street with flyers, and the first person that I saw, I could tell I knew he was from Guatemala because the woman he was walking with, which I assumed was his wife, she had corte on, which is like the traditional Mayan dress in Guatemala. So I approached and I spoke to him in Spanish. I asked if he spoke Mam. At first I said, "Are you from Guatemala?" Just to be polite, even though I knew that he was from Guatemala. He said, "Yes." I said, "Do you speak Mam?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Do you have are you a citizen or a resident? Do you have work authorization?" He said, "Yes." And then I said, "Are you looking for work?" He said, "Yes." And so, that's the kind of the way that you have to go about it, because you're not going to get the results that are needed to fill this demand just by putting something out on the internet. So
So
you have to,
traditional hiring approaches don't work
no,
completely. Understood. Okay.
not sort of these contemporary, based on LinkedIn or other types of job sites. And many Indigenous people that we work with just don't have that kind of, they either don't have the technology, like they don't have a computer maybe,
Right.
or they are not comfortable using technology computers. But many of the people we work with are older, from older generations, which means they haven't yet lost that Indigenous language. And so then they're not comfortable, or they don't really use computers very often. So yeah, it's not likely that there's going to be a bunch of those people that are going to have a LinkedIn profile to see these, sort of job ads, for example.
And do you find more the language combination between Mayan language and Spanish, or Mayan language and English? And how does that impact the provision of the services if you have to do a lot of relay interpretation?
Yeah, so our approach again is that we want to fill the need, and so we have to tap into every resource available. So relay interpreting basically is, I have somebody that speaks Chuch and Spanish, and I can get them on the phone to interpret, and then we get either somebody from the hospital that speaks Spanish as a bilingual staff, or you get a staff interpreter typically from the hospital. And so then, the patient is speaking Chuch, they speak to the interpreter who understands Chuch and interprets into Spanish, and then the Spanish interpreter will interpret the Spanish into English. So you're kind of playing a bit of the kind of the phone game, right, where you're going from one language into another, and then that language into English.
So
Um,
fascinating the way that you have gone about finding interpreters, and I'm sure it hasn't been easy. I mean, as per your description, it sounds like you have to actively get involved, and that's
yes.
fascinating and wonderful, actually. You mentioned that many people have already done interpretation services for their families because they were used as interpreters when they were children and so on. And they have done this for a long time. Have you found, or have you researched whether or not they have difficulties or not implementing the training? And the reason why I ask this is because when you have experience doing interpretation in particular, um, you might have more difficulties actually learning the material of the professional interpretation material,
Sure.
in my experience, because you already set, you're set on your ways, and interpretation is very counterintuitive. And I think that's one of the things people need to understand, is that that's why you need to train as interpreter, because so many of the things that we do are counterintuitive. And a
Sure.
person that has a lot of experience interpreting, often what that means is that they are doing the same mistakes 20 years. So
Sure.
training is very important. So have you had any impression about this, or whether or not they have more difficulty implementing the material or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest issue currently is that there's, especially for our interpreters that don't speak English, there's very little training and resources available to somebody who wants to be an interpreter who doesn't speak English. And so
Mm,
one of the things that we've been doing is advocating for, just as the industry, we need to provide better Spanish language training for interpreters.
mm.
And so
That's
we
that's something I had never thought about. So you would like to have training in Spanish for the
Yeah,
regular training that.
absolutely. Yeah, any kind of training that we provide for interpreters if we want to be able to handle the demand and we want to be able to get more Indigenous language speakers involved in interpreting, we have to be able to provide Spanish language training to them, because if we only do English, we're excluding, a lot of people that can do the work. That now we're excluding that, and that's something that
Yeah.
we're dealing with, right? Because some of our clients will say, well, we want English, and we'll say, well, it's just simply not feasible for some of these languages. There is no known resource that speaks English necessarily. And so you're going to have to use a Spanish relay, and
Yes.
it's really not that hard.
No,
Most of
I
our
can believe that.
right, most of our clients, they already have Spanish staff interpreters that they can utilize to get from the Indigenous language, from Spanish to English. And so, yeah, I mean, we'd absolutely need to have better training for those interpreters. But I would say once we have the trainings, no, I mean, it's the same as any other language, right? Even speakers of Spanish, right, many times have worked unprofessionally as an interpreter, right? Not in a professional capacity. They've interpreted for family members and things like that. Once you go through the training and you learn, okay, I need to speak in the first person to avoid confusion, and the ethical sort of components of making sure you have no conflict of interest and things like that, and you're not inserting your own opinion and things like that. It does obviously take a little bit of practice and getting used to, but once they have that training, it's they have the skill set. I think with Indigenous languages, the most important thing to teach that we are advocating for, and we're actually developing our own trainings and wanting to collaborate as much as we can with others. But the idea is with Indigenous languages, there's a lot less direct word for word translation or interpretation. It's not possible to do word for word interpretation because either the words don't exist, and sometimes the
Mhm,
concepts don't exist.
mhm,
And so the real training that we need to continue to advocate for is to help them really develop the confidence to be able to navigate that, because that doesn't require you to have any particular skill other than being confident in saying, as the interpreter, I need you to explain this in a different way, or I need you to, break it down to the most base level explanation that I can then interpret. There is no word for what it is you're saying in this
mhm.
language. And so I need you to break it down to the basic components, and then that's what I'll interpret. Uh,
Yes.
I think I think right now what's happening a lot of times is that as an Indigenous language interpreter, somebody says something and we know what it is, right? So someone says, "Oh, you have leukemia," and I know, just kind of because of my experiences, right? I know what leukemia is, and so I go ahead and just explain it, right? Okay, the doctor says you have been diagnosed with leukemia, and my interpretation essentially is you've been diagnosed with an illness that's very serious, that is it affects your blood and makes your blood unhealthy, something like that. And really, we should be putting the burden of explanation on the provider. We
Well,
should,
yes,
as the
that's part
interpreter.
of our protocol. But so really important point here, translating those trainings, and also understanding that even the way you manage the flow might look a little different when you are
Yes,
an interpreter of Mayan languages. And what I said about the difficulty adopting new learning. I also want to underscore that it's so important to understand that sometimes we just want everybody to do the exact same job, right? We
yeah,
demand the same standard, like from a Spanish interpreter, um, which is, in the US, there are tests for Spanish in the courts, federal level. There is the whole shebang for Spanish, but not for
right.
other languages. And I think it's important that our users understand that you cannot always get the same uh, the same level of regularity with all the languages, because people have to get there in with training
Yes,
and with standardized testing. So we're still that those are the ways where we perhaps can help and advocate that they get more training, they get more tests that are created specifically for those languages. Wouldn't you say so, Jace?
yes, yeah.
And
And I
mhm,
mean, the language proficiency is another issue that is currently, it's how do we know that this person who says they speak when I became an interpreter, No, very, very few. I think maybe one or two of the dozens of companies that hired me actually had me prove that I could speak Kekchi. We're working with, organizations like LTI and Actful to try and get better standardized language proficiency testing, because it's especially important when you're using somebody like me who's not a native speaker. You really should be testing me to make sure that I speak at the proficient level to be able to interpret, because many times people who are like me who have learned the language, and some recruiter is, as a last ditch effort, is like, oh, I see that you lived in this area and say you speak this language. Many of those people do not have the skill set to be able to interpret. And we tested a lot of people. We tested a lot of people like me, especially at the beginning when we didn't have as many native resources for Kekchi. We tested a lot of people, and I would go through and I would test them, and they had to meet a certain criteria. And if they couldn't, then we would say, sorry, but you're not good enough to interpret, basically. And we had to do that to a lot of different people that were interested. So I think it's very important to do that, even with native language speakers. And it's important to do.
Jace, yes, you brought up some very good points, and we have just a few minutes, so I want to make sure I ask the majority of the questions I had
Yes.
prepared for you. And one is directly related to what you just said, especially someone looking like me, right? That needs to be tested. So for people that are listening to this podcast and not watching it, Jace is white and and tall, and I would not think that he is necessarily a Quiche interpreter. And how do you feel about people questioning you precisely, like, what do you have to say about Indigenous language if you are not from that culture? How do you feel about these questions, and how would you address this?
Yeah, well, and I think, first of all, I think that that's extremely valid. If somebody looks at, the thumbnail of this podcast, and it's a white guy saying, "Okay, we're going to talk about Indigenous languages," they absolutely, you should kind of raise your eyebrows and say, "Well, what's this guy have to do with it?" I think it's very important to make the distinction that I go out and I do podcasts like these specifically to talk about language access. And because I have experienced both, as both having lived in communities where they speak Indigenous languages, having worked as an interpreter for an Indigenous language, and then having started a company that's focused on providing better accessibility for Indigenous languages, I've seen some of the pitfalls in the industry, some of the ways that other companies are not doing it right. I've seen, lots of interactions with our own interpreters, and myself personally as an interpreter, with individuals from Indigenous communities that have limited proficiency in a more dominant language like Spanish. So my purpose is not to claim, that I'm an expert on Indigenous languages or cultures in and of themselves. Unfortunately, because because the base level of awareness about Indigenous languages and cultures is so low, I'm often asked to, well, tell me about, the Mayan languages, or tell me about the Mayan civilizations. And I'm not a historian. I just happen to know more than maybe the average American about certain aspects of these things. But I'm definitely not the right person to ask when want to ask about, what's, other than language access, right? What is it like to be an Indigenous person?
Right, of course. And obviously, you're passionate about this. You want to help a particular community, and that is good for me. Like, I think that is wonderful that you're doing this, that you're going out and about to try to recruit interpreters of languages that are needed so that you can raise the standard of services for
Yes.
people from Indigenous communities. And I think that is what should count. I think your skin color, um, the color of your eyes shouldn't matter, as long as you are passionate about this, and you are doing
Yeah.
everything
And
that
I would just add,
can
I
feel
would
like
just
out.
add to, I would add to that at the end of the day, yeah, it doesn't really necessarily matter, if whatever your skin color is or whatever. But I will say that there are a lot of people who do want to be able to provide services in Indigenous languages, but their motivation for wanting to do that is not always necessarily in the best interest of those communities. And there's a lot of sort of lip service, I would say, that goes around with indigenous languages, particularly with the Mayan languages, because they're more high demand. That, yeah, I do think in those cases it is a bit of a problem. It can definitely be a problem when, for example, somebody is claiming, to have expertise on these languages and they can't back it up, right? So
Yes.
if you're going to come out and say, that we have expertise on these languages, you do have to be able to back it up, right? And so I feel comfortable going out and doing this because I know that my company has, at the end of the day, we have the team, we have the expertise and the knowledge and the dedication to increasing services in lesser diffusion and indigenous languages, that we are going to do those languages right. But some other big company that is claiming to be able to do these things, or wants to be able to do these things, but does not really, at the end of the day, does not do the things like we've talked about, like provide better training for Spanish language interpreters, does not have the expertise to know about the different variants of within each of these languages, right? Each indigenous language usually has at least a few, sometimes up to as many as 50 or 60 distinct variants of the language that you have to be aware of. And every time, if some company does not do that and they say, oh, yes, I can do Zapoteco, and then the client, calls this big company, and it ends up being, well, they have a Zapoteco interpreter from this town, but this person needs it from this town. Every time something like that happens, the client is left thinking, okay, well, it just seems like we're just not going to be able to get that language or that variant. And therefore, my assumption is that nobody else can do it either. And then that person that really needed that service goes underserviced, right?
Yeah.
So, I do think it is important to ask the right questions. You need to ask, where do you get your interpreters, right? How are you training your interpreters? And why are you doing this, right? Why is it that you're doing this? Is it because you're looking to make profits, or is it because you really do, at the end of the day, want to help indigenous communities be able to have equal accessibility to their own native languages?
And they shouldn't be mutually exclusive. I also find the argument that if you are a business, you don't really want to help. And I think that is incorrect. And I face a lot of people like that in
Sure,
my own community, that the fact that I own a business or automatically is as if I was an evil person, right?
sure, sure,
It's like,
right.
no, I mean, they shouldn't be contradictory to one another. But I
Sure,
definitely, that's a conversation for another time.
sure,
I
sure.
just have one more question for you, and skipping over everything about the new executive order, because I know we could absolutely do a completely brand new podcast on that question only.
Yep.
But you know that part of what we're trying to do through our effective inclusion through language access program is shift the way institutions think about language, not
Yes.
as a barrier, but as a right? And the program goes beyond interpretation and translation. It's really about creating systems that are culturally responsive, linguistically inclusive, and centered on equity, especially for people who speak languages that are often overlooked, like many indigenous and Mayan languages. So, given your experience learning Quechua and working closely with Mayan languages speakers, I'd love to hear your thought on this kind of training for the for the providers specifically. Where do you see opportunities for this kind of program?
Yes, I mean, I think that that is absolutely one of the most important things that we need to teach, right? And we need to train, because, the interpreters are kind of the front line of defense. They're the ones that can recognize, especially when it comes to indigenous languages, they recognize if someone has maybe limited proficiency in Spanish or another language. But it would go a long way for institutions and organizations to have better understanding, better awareness of language in general. What is a language, and what makes a language, and why is it important to give that person the right to speak in their own language in these settings, right? I think that that's critical. I think that it's absolutely very important, and I think it would be wonderful to include some of what we talked about today, because it goes so much further than just saying you need to make sure that the individuals get the language that they want, because they may think, oh, well, they want Spanish because they came in here speaking Spanish. People need to understand that language is not necessarily this black and white thing. It's not, oh, you either speak Spanish or you don't. It's a spectrum, right? Same with English. It's a spectrum, and I would consider myself pretty fluent in Spanish, but if I was in a hospital in a Spanish speaking country, and needed some procedure, I would absolutely want someone to help explain it in English, so that I would know for sure what's going on. And the consequences of not doing that can be severe. They can be dire, right? There's loss of life that can happen, or life altering, surgeries or procedures that they didn't fully consent to because they were not provided an explanation in their own language. And at the end of the day, unfortunately, you said earlier that we need to help Indigenous people advocate for themselves, and I think that that's true. And there are organizations, community-based organizations, who do that more. But at the end of the day, we can't just say, oh, well, we expect that if they didn't understand, they should have said something, because we have to understand all of the context, the full picture. We have to understand that they are used to not getting, any kind of service in their own language. Typically, we have to understand that they, might be too shy to ask, or whatever it may be. We have to understand what that is. And at the end of the day, we have to recognize if somebody's not fully understanding, and take the extra additional steps to make sure that we figure out what it is, and then we provide that as a resource to them to be able to understand fully.
Right. We have a duty of care to them. And thank you so much, Jace. I think it's been wonderful, all the information that you've shared. I certainly will. I learn a lot. Let's begin with that. And will certainly include more of this content as I myself teach on language access and how to be better professionals and better people, right? I think you're absolutely right that we shouldn't just be like, well, they should have asked for something, right? We should be more in touch with the depth of this need, and how language really plays a huge role in all areas of public life, not only communication, but identity. And so thank you for enlightening us about Indigenous languages. And I hope to have you again in my podcast. Thank you for coming and accepting.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. It was great to speak to you about it. Thank you.
And that wraps up another enlightening episode of Language Access Matters. We hope you have enjoyed our discussion on the profound impact language access has across various sectors of society. Let's remember that language access is not just an isolated topic. It intertwines with various fields, impacting lives and businesses in profound ways. As we continue this journey together into becoming a more inclusive society where we ensure equal access to services to those who don't speak the dominant language, we want to assure you that our company, Equal Access Language Services, through its podcast Language Access Matters, will be with you every step of the way. We are committed to bringing you thought-provoking conversations, expert opinions, and stories from the field and beyond. To dive deep into the subject matter and engage with leading experts in the field, we will release a new episode of Language Access Matters once a month. By featuring expert practitioners and individuals with diverse experiences, we aim to broaden the scope of our discussions and present a comprehensive view of the importance of language access. We encourage you to stay connected with us through our website, www.equalaccesslanguageservices.com, and our social media platforms. You can join the conversation, ask questions, and share your own stories and experiences. If you want to be part of our podcast, email us to podcast@equalaccesslanguageservices.com. Remember, language access matters to each and every one of us. By understanding its significance and actively working towards its advancement, we can create a more inclusive and equitable society. Thank you for being a part of the Language Access Matters community. We appreciate your support and look forward to sharing more knowledge, inspiration, and empowerment with you in our future episodes.